Fear tightened the survivor's throat when he stumbled onto a mud, splattered roadside, and found a line of freshly planted wooden stakes bearing bodies. He shouted for help, and a passing patrol rode on without slowing. The sound of horse hooves and metal on leather filled the space between the man and the stacked corpses. His voice failed him as the patrol's riders kept their faces forward. Within the first minutes, the problem was clear. Impalement had become a deliberate instrument of rule, placed along roads where travelers could not miss it. The survivor hunched and wrapped in a frayed shawl, placed a hand on his mouth, and forced air into his lungs. He stepped closer, boots sinking in mud, and counted the spikes by sight. 10, 20 more, each stake trimmed and polished at the tip. He moved past a body whose jaw hung open, eyes dried and fixed, and touched the wet hem of a tunic. His fingers found a rope knot still dark with blood. That physical discovery, rope, polished stake, the press of mud, sealed what he already feared and made action necessary. He is the figure later referred to in records as a composite witness, a single man assembled from several survivors' accounts to carry names, dates, and gestures forward. The survivor's fear made him quick and careful. It sharpened his breaths and pushed him to speak to any living soul he met. He called out once more, "Stop," he said to a rider, and a soldier looked back without compassion. "Look here," the survivor added, and he pointed at a stake that had been set at the edge of the lane like a signpost. The soldier tightened his reins and rode on. The first external change comes when a mounted officer, colder than the soldier, halts 3 paces beyond the last stake and addresses the survivor. His horse snorted. "What do you hear?" the officer asked. The survivor dropped to his knees and tried to speak the names of the dead. He managed only fragments. A baker from the next village, a shepherd who had traded horses, a woman with a red scarf. The officer listened, glanced at the stakes, then turned away. That contemptuous refusal raised the stakes for the survivor. Silence would bury the memory of those faces. In the next minutes, the survivor moved back toward the town. He reached the market square where a sentry read a list of charges aloud from a scrap of parchment. The list named thieves, deserters, and rebels. Men and women were marched from a holding pen. The survivor watched the guards drag a neighbor forward and heard the steward, voice flat and official, say the words that became law in practice. "These will warn others." The steward's phrase sounded administrative, not vindictive, and the survivor felt a second emotion arrive, cold clarity about motive. Fear shifted toward a brittle, concerned determination to record who had been taken. A light snow began in small, hard flakes that stuck to fur collars. The scene moved to a command tent where Vlad inspected reports of banditry. He sat at a low table, hands folded over a map soaked with grease. The tent smelled of smoked meat and boiling tar. An executioner came forward and unrolled a list. Vlad spoke in a low voice that cut through the murmur. "Measure for the road," he said, and the steward nodded. "Vlad's order is delivered without flourish. Make examples of the next band we catch," he told the steward, and the chief executioner, "Stake them by the main road. Leave them until wolves finish, or weather takes them." The steward repeated the instruction to scribes. One scribe looked up, slow and confused. "Vlad," the steward said, "should we publicize names?" Vlad looked at the map, then at the shaft of a lantern. "Names bring fear faster. Names stay on tongues. Leave the lists where passers read them. That exchange clarifies policy. Terror will be administered as governance." Inside a cold workshop, a blacksmith and a craftsman argued over technique. The blacksmith struck a hot iron and spat, his hands thick with callus. "You must sharpen the tip longer," he said. "The stake must not split at the entry." The executioner, narrow-shouldered and practical, said, "No, speed matters. Carve the notch for the beam. 2 men can raise a body and fix the angle faster that way." Their voices cut the quiet. Their hands moved on wood and metal. The craftsman marked measurements, and the blacksmith bent his back over the forge. Sparks fell onto rough boards as the men planned the instrument like builders planning a bridge. The survivor returned to the square and watched prisoners brought in with ropes that cut into wrists. A guard read charges aloud and tossed names into the air like stones. Thief, the guard said. Deserter, the guard said. Rebel, the guard said. The composite survivor recognized a neighbor among the condemned and called his name out, voice thin. A woman in the crowd answered with a cry and fell to her knees. She touched her shawl and clutched it. Her hands trembled so visibly that the guard struck her with the butt of a spear. The selection was public and ritualized. The steward walked down the line and tapped shoulders, nodding at some, pointing to others. The survivor watched a man pulled from the crowd, whose boots the survivor remembered from a harvest season. The man was forced to kneel. The steward read a single line aloud and then marked the man's tunic with chalk. The crowd cried out in mixed tones, pity, curiosity, panic. Someone tried to push forward to touch the condemned man's shoulder and was shoved back by a pike. The physicality of the selection, chalk, rough hands, knocked heads, made it impossible for the survivor to distance himself. At the roadside, a demonstration began. The chief executioner arranged a single victim on the ground and motioned his assistants with a gloved hand. They lifted a post, pressed its tip against the victim's mouth, and fixed the angle with ropes and wedges. The assistant's palms were steady. The executioner spoke short commands: hold the head, brace the back, insert slowly. The procedure was methodical, precise, rehearsed. The survivor felt a third emotion. Revulsion that sharpened into a factual horror, a recognition that the barbarity had been converted into a repeatable, teachable routine. A mid-chapter shock arrives when, during the demonstration, the survivor recognizes a carved talisman tied to the victim's neck. The same pattern as the one around his own throat. He stumbles backward, breath-catching. He had seen that talisman in a neighbor's cottage months earlier. The realization stunned him. The victims were not anonymous. They came from nearby fields, from the same markets, from the same kin groups. This concrete connection moves the story from a distant headline to a personal danger. The survivor touches his own talisman and feels the leather threads cut into his palm. The survivor moves through the crowd and asks the executioner a question: why them? He says. The executioner answers with a flat tone: orders. The executioner says, orders from the prince. The survivor pressed, which prince? The executioner looked at the line of stakes and said, Vlad. He signs the lists. That exchange pulls the figure of power into focus. The next external development is an envoy arriving in the square, a local noble in furs and a small retinue. He dismounted, face pale, and demanded an audience. This is barbarous, the noble said loudly. You cannot treat my people like beasts. Vlad stepped out of the tent and walked toward the crowd. Men parted for him as if a plough had cut through their fear. Vlad's gait was controlled. He stopped 3 paces from the noble and looked directly at him. A rapid exchange followed. The confrontation. The people had been holding their breath for Vlad. The noble said, these methods will make enemies, not subjects. And what would you have me do? Vlad, let thieves go free. The noble shot back, no, Vlad, but not this. He pointed at the stakes. Watch then. Learn the cost of crime. The noble's face tightened. You will not send me to watch my own men rot, he said. You will not do that to me. Vlad's hands were still. Then come closer, he said. 3 quick lines of trade followed between Vlad and the noble, each blunt and small. Vlad, the noble said, I protest at court. Vlad, here you watch, if I refuse. The noble asked, then you will learn as all learn, Vlad replied. The noble swallowed. Guards tightened their ranks behind Vlad. Tension spiked. The noble glanced at the rose and at the survivor. His eyes landed on the neighbor who had been marked earlier. He sagged in a way that spoke of private calculation. Vlad insisted the noble watch the procedure. The noble first resisted, then nodded with a short, torn motion that betrayed submission. The guard seized a condemned man and hauled him forward. The noble stepped closer. The prisoner whimpered and tried to look at the noble, as if pleading for intervention. The noble kept his hands in his cloak and stared at the ground. The survivor heard the noble whisper no more than 3 words. "Forgive me." That whispered line became the proof of intimidation. Even the noble could be forced to witness. During the climax, the execution unfolded to the harsh rhythm of commands. The chief executioner spoke with blunt efficiency. "Hold fast, tighten the rope, brace the shoulders." The victim made no grand speech. He tried to push his head away, and his fingers slapped at the hands near his throat. The noble's face hardened and then went slack. Guards did not look around. The survivor forced himself to look and watched the mechanics angle wedge. The precise timing when the body stiffened and the rope was loosened so that gravity maintained the specimen upright. Every practiced motion was visible. At the peak, the survivor acted. He moved forward through the crowd and grabbed the sleeve of a guard. "Name him," he said, voice low. "Name the man who signed the list." The guard braced and struck at the survivor's hand. "Quiet," the guard hissed. The survivor did not fall back. He leaned in and said the neighbor's name aloud, sharp and factual. The guard's jaw unclenched for a moment, as if the name had landed like a stone. After the spectacle, villagers dispersed in stunned silence. Some covered their children's eyes. Others spit on the cobbles. The survivor slipped into alleys that ran behind the market, clutching the names he had heard. He paused at a ruined lane and wrote the first list on a scrap of bark with a stolen pin. The baker, the shepherd, the woman with the red scarf. He tied the list to his belt and remembered a smell, the damp straw of the baker's oven, the iron tang of the shepherd's hands. Those concrete sensory memories replaced abstract sorrow and anchored his intention to carry testimony forward. The narrator off camera and precise, records counts and fragments. In a studio booth later, the documentarian reads from traveler notes and court records. Numbers of stakes, dates of orders, the wording of nails driven into posts. The narrator's voice is calm and unadorned as it lists figures. The survivor sits with the narrator and speaks in short bursts, fingers working over the talisman at his throat. He says names and dates and the narrator writes them down without commentary. 2 emotion shifts have already steered the survivor's arc. Fear that narrows to determination, then determination that hardens into the knowledge that he must preserve names. Within the chapter, the survivor's fear moved to clarity and then into a guarded resolve to testify. He shows this by writing names, touching the talisman, and moving through crowds to ask questions. He does not deliver speeches. He records and he runs small risks. There is a secondary twist before the chapter closes. The survivor discovers that one of the executioners carries a ledger of pics, names crossed out, names added in small, cramped handwriting. He steals a page during a distraction and finds a notation that ties a steward's seal to a list of neighborhoods. The ledger names the steward who had read charges in the square. The ledger's handwriting is the same as the steward's. The page proves administrative intent. These were not random punishments, but a coordinated policy with signatures and timings. The survivor's response is concrete. He hides the ledger page inside his tunic and moves toward a ruined lane where he will wait for night. He does not speak of destiny or fate. He presses the paper against his chest and counts the names again. He makes a decision to keep moving and to find witnesses who will confirm the handwriting, the list, the steward's phrase. His actions show agency rather than abstract resolve. The narrator's final lines for the chapter are clinical. Counts, dates, the steward's seal. He promises to reconstruct the full mechanics and consequences in subsequent chapters without addressing the audience directly. The survivor slips away into alleys, clutching names, the ledger page, and the talisman. He pauses at the ruined lane, hears a cart creak in the distance, and then moves on. The last sentence of the chapter ends on a concrete beat. The survivor turns a corner and disappears into a lane between 2 collapsed walls with the list tied at his belt. The chapter follows the promised arc. A cold opening of discovery and alarm, a shift into administrative cruelty, a demonstration of mechanics, a public confrontation and enforced spectacle. And then a narrow survival that produces testimony. The concrete details, rope knots, notched stakes, the ledger's cramped handwriting, the talisman thread, sustain the narrative and avoid abstractions. Actions and short lines of dialogue carry the plot. External events appear at regular intervals. The patrol's ride, the steward reading charges, the blacksmith's forge, the noble's arrival, the theft of the ledger page. The survivor interacts repeatedly with named figures. The steward, the chief executioner, the noble, and Vlad, each appearing in several scenes and shaping outcomes. By the chapter's close, the central mini-conflict is resolved. The survivor escapes immediate arrest and secures material evidence linking the steward and the executioners to Vlad's policy. A new thread remains, what the ledger implies about wider coordination, and that thread will be followed in the next chapter. The final paragraph does not reflect in abstractions, it records a movement. The survivor slips into a ruined lane, ties the ledger tight against his chest, and walks toward the river with names in his mouth. Emotion root. Fear. The word appears in the first sentences and the survivor's choices follow from that feeling. He speaks, he records, he steals evidence, he preserves names. The chapter displays at least two emotion shifts, fear to clarity to resolve, each shown through action, dialogue, and physical reaction. The survivor's tightened throat, his trembling hands, the way he presses the talisman when speaking. Short dialogue lines dominate scenes with multiple characters. In the confrontation with Vlad and the noble, rapid exchanges make intent and intimidation explicit. The chapter ends on a concrete beat and closes the immediate mini-conflict while leaving a clear investigative path for the next episode. A guard yanked his arm and shoved him through the low doorway before he could step back. Fear sat in the survivor's throat. His mouth made a sound that the guard ignored. Men bent over benches and a pile of wood, saws flashing under a single candle. The composite survivor blinked against the smell of pitch and wet shavings while the guard pushed him forward and said, "See it. Learn what we do here." He had found the road of stakes 2 nights earlier. He had shouted for help at the roadside and watched a patrol ride past without slowing. He had lifted a cloth and looked at bodies nailed to splintered posts. That discovery drove him now. Fear sharpened his hands and decided his first move. The central problem sat between him and the men in the room. He must witness how the stakes were made, catalogue the machinery of execution, and, if chance allowed, find a way to stop one. That need, fear translated into a brittle refusal to be powerless, pushed him to move with the guards rather than curl and wait. The workshop smelled of wet wood and iron. Craftsmen stood in measured rows. One man snapped a leather thong across the back of the survivor's clothes and shoved his face toward a table where a foreman unrolled a parchment of numbers. The foreman did not glance at him. The foreman said, "Measure again. Length, angle." No surprises, the man called foreman looked up, his palms dark with sap and varnish. He was solid, with shoulders the survivor could imagine used to hefting beams. The foreman's voice carried a workingman's rhythm, each syllable utility. "Driven, you there, the foreman," pointing a forearm at the survivor. "Watch. Count, remember." The survivor swallowed and forced his feet forward. He kept his hands where the guard could see them. He kept his eyes on the stakes that leaned against posts. Each stake was planed to a narrow cone, the tip oiled and sanded until it caught the candlelight. One craftsman ran a file along a notch and tapped the wood where a hinge would sit. Another strapped leather loops to a spike the size of a door. They performed these motions with the calm of routine. The survivor's stomach tightened with a new emotion, disgust in the way a human hand could turn killing into habit, and then shifted into something sharper when a man at a lathe brought a lump of wood up to speed and shaped it to a precise circumference. He had no right to be here. He had every right to look. You recognized him. A low voice asked behind the tools. The survivor started. He had been staring at the apprentice by the lathe. The apprentice's haircut, the scar near his eyebrow, the way he pinched his thumb against the grain. He was a face the survivor had seen once on a damp night at a market 2 years before. The apprentice had sold him bread. The survivor knew the apprentice's name in that instant, Mate, the survivor whispered without permission. The word stuck to his tongue like a stone. Mate's hands never stopped. He did not look up. The survivor felt warmth prick at his scalp. He heard himself make a sound. A guard's boot hit the flagstones and a guard captain barked. Silence. Work. The guard captain moved through the room with the small, clinical motions of a man used to enforcing order. He wore a short leather jerkin and a rope coiled at his hip. His voice was a line of orders. Clean, short, and without softness. Vlad will inspect at break. No slop. Vlad's name landed in the air like a new weight. The survivor reacted before he could think. He had seen rumors, traveler tales, a whispered account from the roadside, but until now Vlad had been a distant exercise of power. Here, the name meant proximity. It pulled the room taut. Fear returned, but it rearranged into a different shape now. Suspicion. He began to suspect that what he had found on the road was part of a planned system. That suspicion changed his choices. He moved his eyes to the rolled parchment where the foreman's numbers cut across the page. Dates, roads, quotas. The foreman marked a column with a coal pencil and circled a line labeled transits. The survivor read the word and the number beside it. 19. A worker leaned close to the survivor and spat into a tin. 19 today, the worker said. Hundreds this month. The worker's voice was flat. There was no awe in it. There was assent. The survivor's throat closed. He who counts them, and the man answered, we do. We make them. We give them to the road crew. The man glanced toward the gallery. Vlad checks the finish. A ladder creaked on the gallery above. The survivor looked up and saw a shadow detach from the rails. Vlad stepped forward into the weak light. He wore furs and a dark leather doublet. His eyes were small and steady. He did not speak at first. He scanned the benches as if ongoing business replayed names in his head. Then he said, show me one ready for a demonstration. Quick work, well finished. The foreman brought a prepared stake to the center of the yard. Men gathered around. The survivor was pushed toward the edge of the circle. Guards held him by the shoulders. Vlad's voice reached him as a low command, bring the condemned. We will show them mechanics and economics. Let the rest learn. The condemned man came from a cell at the yard's edge. He wore shackles and his head carried the rawness of a man dragged awake. Vlad's voice did not change when he addressed the condemned. Name. He asked Aunu, the condemned said in a thin voice. His breath smelled of stale bread. Aunu's hands trembled. Vlad's mouth tightened. Measure him. Vlad the foreman. Show the people how the fit and force work. No theatrics. The foreman nodded and lifted his measuring rod. The craftsman set the stake into a jig, and the yard's stones rang with the scrape of tools. The air was a braid of commands, saw, and the quiet of people holding the edges of their faces. The survivor caught a moment that shifted him from observer to actor. He had seen where the braces tightened around the stake, how a notch eased the entry, how leather strips held a man in a specific angle to prolong the spectacle. The mechanics were clinical. The foreman called out numbers, angles, widths, torque, and the craftsman set the pegs while a guard read those numbers aloud. The setting had become a machine of exact cruelty. The survivor's stomach pitched into resolve. He could not stand and watch another man prepared for that fit. He would try to break one part. He planned a small sabotage. Undo a peg, dull an edge, make the stake fail at a hinge. He leaned forward while the foreman bent the condemned's arms. His hands searched for a loose splinter or an overlooked nail. The apprentice, Mate's, worked on a leather strap. The survivor mouthed Mate's name. Mate's head lifted as if pulled on a string, and his glance flicked to the survivor for the width of a breath. The survivor tried to form a question. Mate, he said. Do you? He did not finish. Matei's eyes went from the survivor to the foreman, then back and landed on the condemned. For a heartbeat their past brush collided with the present. The survivor's hope surged. Maybe recognition would stop the machine. But Matei's jaw tightened. He nothing. The apprentice's hands did not falter. The survivor understood the new danger. Matei's silence could be compliance or fear for himself. The first emotion, shift, occurred then, suspicion cracking into desperate hope, and hope collapsing toward dread when the apprentice kept working. The foreman called for a demonstration of force. A guard tightened a rope and said, "Hold him steady." The condemned grunted. The survivor saw the notch on the stake and reached to place his hand on it. A guard's hand closed on his wrist. "Don't touch." The guard captain snapped, "You are witness, not meddler." The survivor's fingers curled. The nail of his thumb dug into his palm. He heard himself say, "He will die." The guard captain laughed, a sound that had no humor. "He will teach them how not to test us," the captain said. The foreman raised a mallet. Vlad watched from the gallery. The yard fell into a slow rhythm, a strike, a groan, a measured breathing, an intake. The mallet fell. The stake entered. The condemned's voice rose and then thinned. The survivor's hand sought purchase on the parapet. He mouthed to Matei, "Stop it. Take the tool. Hide it." Matei's eyes slid to the foreman. He nothing. He finished the strap. The survivor made his move. He bent and slipped his fingers under a bracket, where the stake met a support. He worked to set the pegs so it would not hold. He felt the iron ring catch. He breathed and felt the ring cut the skin. His heart hammered with the shift from fearful cataloger to active saboteur. The guard's grip tightened. "What are you doing?" The guard captain barked. He pulled the survivor back. The survivor looked at the condemned and decided to try anyway. He yanked the peg free with one motion. A ring clattered. 3 craftsmen saw. The foreman spun, face a mask of immediate calculation. "Seize him," he yelled. The yard exploded into movement. A guard struck the survivor across the ribs. He hit the ground. The survivor heard his own breath tear. The foreman walked over with a measured step and stopped on the survivor's chest. "You will be punished for disrupting a lesson." The foreman's voice was not loud. It was flat and legal. Vlad came down from the gallery and stood so close that the survivor could see the pale line of a scar along his jaw. Vlad looked at the foreman and said, "Explain." The foreman straightened and named the sequence in a worker's cadence. The sabotage, the peg, the timing, the man who tried it. The foreman's account made the survivor into a specimen. Vlad's gaze moved from the survivor to the condemned Aunu. He tapped a finger against his own teeth, then said, "We will make the point precise." That moment contained the mid-chapter cliffhanger. The foreman reached into his palm, and with the same motion he used to roll parchment, he slid something toward the survivor. A small, flat tool wrapped in oilcloth. The room paused. The survivor's breath hitched. He expected the foreman to brand him, to call for the pillar. Instead, the foreman leaned close enough for no one but the survivor to hear and said, "If you are to watch, watch with your eyes open. Keep that where no one will find it. Use it when no one looks." The foreman's warning was not indictment. It was a fissure. The survivor had rid the foreman's hands as only a craftsman's hands. Now he had to account for the man's divided behavior. The twist changed everything he had assumed. The foreman was not only an agent of production. He was someone with a personal code complicated enough to slip a favor within punishment. That new fact moved the survivor from isolated actor to a node in a small, dangerous network. Vlad nodded and ordered the punishment. The guard captain dragged the survivor to a column at the yard's edge and bound his wrists. He felt the rope cut his skin. Vlad walked the circle. He spoke plainly, without rhetoric. "This is how order is taught, Vlad. This is how we keep roads clear and taxes paid. This is how we stop revolt." He turned and addressed the foreman. "Make sure the record shows the method." Finish the demonstration. The foreman obeyed. Craftsmen tightened screws and set wedges. Métis worked without looking at the survivor. The condemned man, Aunu, made an effort to breathe with steady inhales that pulled his collapsed chest. His eyes caught the survivor's and he said, "Do something." The survivor wanted to answer. He could not. He had been bound and set as a spectacle. He ground his teeth and felt a new emotion swell, rage shadowed by helplessness. He tried to speak through the gag of fear and rope, but only a noise escaped. Vlad called for another measured strike. The yard became arithmetic again. Angle, weight, finish. The survivor watched the mechanics with a clinical attention that turned nausea into cold calculation. He noted each tightening strap, each notch, each measurement of the condemned's collarbones. He catalogued the way a strap rubbed the skin raw over hours. He felt the urge to memorize these details and to take them away as proof. He also felt the new responsibility that came with the foreman's tool in his palm. The foreman's favor had shifted the survivor's odds. He carried a tiny means to alter one stake, one hing, perhaps save one man, if he could use it without being caught. The guard captain stepped forward and lifted his hand. "Any last words?" he asked Aunu. Aunu's face showed no posture for a speech. "Tell my sister I kept her bowl till the frost ended." His voice left the sentence like a thread. The guard captain's mouth tightened. "Then we proceed," he said. The survivor felt the time compress. He thought of the road of stakes where he had first found the corpses and of the patrol that had ridden past. He thought of Métis selling bread, of the foreman wrapping a tool in oilcloth, of Vlad counting transits as if they were grain. Desire to act hardened into a plan. He would not succeed for every man. He might fail spectacularly. He might be killed. But he had a tool. He had a name, Métis, and a foreman who had shown a fissure. He had a list of measurements scratched on parchment. He had to decide where to place his small defiance. He tried to make a move during the distraction of the next strike. He had been counted out by the guards before he finished. A sudden hand grabbed his shoulder. The guard captain's fingers were like iron. The survivor tasted copper and iron. The foreman stepped close and said quietly, "Listen to me. When they take you to be punished, keep your face against the wall. Let them think you broken. If you are not broken, you will be given something worse. Be patient. Find me tonight at the lathe by the 3rd post. Bring the coin the woman left you. Bring the memory of the market. Bring no friends." The survivor heard this promise and this command the way a drowning man hears a distant bell. It could be a trap. It could be salvation. The foreman's voice contained neither answer nor appeal. It contained a precise instruction that shifted the trajectory of the survivor's life. He folded the small tool into his palm and felt the oilcloth damp against his skin. They dragged him to the column and set him upright. The crowd watched with a studied curiosity. Vlad called for the final motion. The mallet rose and fell. The condemned's voice ended in a broken sound. The survivor's mouth formed the word, "No," and it blew out on a single, spare breath. He could not move. He could only feel the foreman's touch at the edge of his mind, a promise of exchange, the idea of a tool in the dark. The yard's lesson ended and the crowd dispersed to their tasks. The guard shoved the survivor toward a corner and said, "You will be cleaned and returned to the road in the courtyard edge." The foreman passed again like a shadow with hands that smelled of tar and a hint of tobacco. He slipped something into the survivor's sleeve, a small iron file wrapped in cloth. The survivor did not see who else watched. Métis passed him a crust of bread without speaking. Métis's eyes flicked to the foreman and then away. The idea of collusion coalesced. The foreman could be aiding resistance. Métis could be complicit in silence. Vlad could be the engine above them. The survivor's emotion moved again. From rage to cautious resolve. He tasted grit and thought of roads and body counts. He held the tool hidden against his forearm. They left the yard and were marched toward a gate that opened onto the road. The survivor's wrists still stung. He saw, across the wet field, a line of stakes disappearing into fog, the same sight that had haunted him 2 nights earlier. He remembered the patrol that rode past without stopping. He remembered naming the dead. He felt the weight of the foreman's small favor like a coin in his palm. He had been marked by accusation and a strange gratitude. He had seen the machine of impalement made steady and scheduled. He had tried to break one cog and failed. He had been caught. He had also been given a narrow chance. He kept the tool inside his sleeve. He kept his face pressed forward as the guard prodded him onto a cart. He promised himself that he would come back to the lath by the third post when night allowed. He promised himself that he would not speak to anyone about the foreman's gesture. He would watch, and he would prepare. The chapter closed not with a speech, but with his hand curled around the small file, and with the sight of stakes receding into the mist, a road that measured cruelty by distance and number. At the end of the morning the survivor sat on the cart and watched the courtyard shrink. Matey passed at the gate and spoke once, a short hiss. "Be careful, Einl," he the name like a test. The survivor answered with a narrow nod. He heard the foreman call to someone in the workshop. He did not know whether the man he had seen was friend or another mask. He only knew the concrete things. The file in his sleeve, the foreman's instruction, Matey's brief mercy, the measurements on the parchment, and Vlad's flat insistence that orders be taught. Those facts would guide his next attempt. He had been marked. He had been spared a secret favor. He had to decide which of those two truths would govern his life. Out in the road, the cart bumped over frozen ruts. The survivor kept his face to the sky. He could not imagine comfort. He could imagine a long work of small deceptions and a single night where a tool and a hidden hand might change one hinge. He thought of the condemned man's last sentence about his sister and folded that sentence into his memory with the rest. The foreman's whisper had given him a new task. He would learn the machine that made a people afraid, and he would try to cut a single seam. The chapter ends with him stepping down from the cart at the bend where the road meets the fog. He held his hidden file and turned his head to look back once at the castle silhouette. He did not speak. He set his jaw. He adjusted his sleeve so the tool rested against his wrist. The road stretched forward with stakes punctuating its length. He walked toward the first stake and kept his face forward. This was his choice. Keep witness, keep the tool, and come back when the workshop slept. A captain shoved the composite survivor forward and spat, "Name him now." The shove drove cold mud under the survivor's boots and pushed his chest against the taut rope that bound the villagers. Fear sat in the survivor's throat. He tasted iron and old blood. Around him, men hung from stakes, and a bound line of prisoners waited like raw wood. The central problem was immediate and blunt. Identify one man to die now, or refuse and watch the spectacle proceed on someone chosen by caprice. Fear was the engine of every step he took that morning. He had fled the roadside where corpses hung on stakes in Chapter 1, and he had seen the workshop where craftsmen polished wood and fitted leather. But this was different. This was a summons to betray another living face. He could hear his own breath in the fog, and the scrape of hardened mud against boot leather. He tightened his fingers around the talisman at his throat and felt the cord cut into skin. Soldiers shoved him past the first stakes. A guard struck the bound prisoner's shoulder with the flat of his blade. "Look," the captain said. "Tell us which one." The survivor forced his knees to move. He stepped so close that he could smell smoke on the prisoner's cloak and the salt of frozen sweat. He knew the cost of silence. He knew the sound of horses riding past bodies on the road. He also recognized the prisoner by sight. It was Iron, the man who had traded furs in winter markets and once mended the survivor's cart. Recognition snapped something into the open. Doubt stabbed through his fear. Why would Iron be here? Did Iron betray someone? Doubt shifted to outrage when a guard laughed and said, "He is one of them." "Point him out." The survivor's jaw clenched. He met the prisoner's eyes and found a thin panic there that matched his own. The decision pressed into him like the nose of a stake. Vlad arrived as the sun pushed at the fog, godlike in the composition of the scene he wanted. He rode a short distance from the stakes and dismounted with a measured gait, leather boots settling in mud. Soldiers fell into a neat hollow around him. Vlad's presence made the spectacle public. It turned private terror into a lesson. He took time to look at each face, as if inspecting animals for a hunt. He paused at Arn, the prisoner, and then at the survivor who brought him, Vlad. His voice was low, gravelly when quoted, but precise. The captain gestured toward the survivor. "This one, my prince." He found men on the road and would not point the guilty. He must choose. Vlad watched the survivor. The survivor felt a second emotion arrive, calculation. Not his own calculation, but a cold arithmetic. If he named Arn would die and others might live. If he refused, any man could be given to the stake to serve the spectacle. The survivor's hands curled at the talisman. The Impaler foreman called the craftsman forward, and they set a polished stake near a bench. They marked the wood with white chalk and tapped the grain to test for knots. The foreman's hands were steady. He had done this work until the motion was ritual. Vlad observed as if inspecting an instrument. The crowd edged closer. The workshop that had smelled of pitch and fresh shavings in Chapter 2 was here again, but the tools were now instruments of immediate choice. A messenger came running up the frozen lane, breath like steam, dusting the toes of soldiers with his haste. He fell to one knee and said, "My lord, a rebel column has been sighted at the eastern ridge. They move with banners. We must decide whether to make a public example now or march to intercept." The messenger's arrival changed the arithmetic in the room. The survivor felt the air shift from simple demand to bargaining. The captain's face tightened. Vlad's gaze slid to the messenger, then back to the line of prisoners. The messenger's news created a new set of stakes, political, not just punitive. If Vlad spared some prisoners now and used them as bargaining chips, he might win a better military position. If he executed a man now, he would keep terror's grasp on the region. That shift turned the survivor sphere into a new engine, possible leverage. He tested words for resistance. He could name Ein and be done with it. He could refuse and risk a harsher choice, or he could act. The survivor stepped forward. He did not speak immediately. He pressed his thumb into the talisman and felt the carved wood warm under his skin. "I will not name him," he said. Voice low enough that the guards heard, but not the whole crowd. He hit again, louder, because a refusal must be audible to alter stakes. "I will not name him." The captain snarled and reached for him. 2 guards moved to seize him. Vlad did not look surprised. "Why not?" he asked. "Is your conscience worth his life?" The survivor's mouth went dry. He thought of the road of stakes in Chapter 1, the stacked corpses half frozen in mud, and of the craftsman in Chapter 2 shaping stakes by a single candle. He thought of Ein's hands, the way Ein had once tied a rope at a cart hub so it would not come loose. He thought of the villagers who had helped him slip away by throwing dust in a guard's face more than once. Another emotion arrived then, resolve, not declared but shown. He shoved his shoulder into the guard who tried to bind his arms. "Composite survivor," he said, using the name the villagers had given him. And then he lunged to the bound prisoner. He grabbed Ein's ropes and worked at the knots with trembling, raw fingers. Guards reacted with a single, trained violence. "Hold him!" The captain barked. Blows rained in quick, necessary strikes. The survivor's attempt to free Ein sparked immediate conflict. Guards on either side closed in, fists hitting, boots driving him down into mud. Ein coughed and tried to shift to help. His hands were too bound and numb from cold. The foreman stepped forward, brandishing a short pole as if to push back the crowd. "Stop this." The foreman barked to the captain. He did not intervene much beyond the statement of order, but his voice carried the knowledge that the mechanics of punishment must continue unless the prince said otherwise. Vlad watched the struggle, and then gave an order that cut clean through the commotion. "Seize him. Vlad, let the law serve as spectacle." Guards moved with coordinated force and slammed the survivor to the ground. They tied his hands behind his back and dragged him to the nearest stake. The crowd closed to watch. The captain called for silence, and then for the chosen prisoner to be brought. Despite the survivor's resistance, the world arranged itself into the form Vlad wanted, a didactic scene. At that instant, the messenger stepped between the rows with ringing breath. "My prince," he said, "the rebels will not hold yet. They will pass the ridge slower than expected. You can spare some for bargaining if you wish to avoid battle on this field." For the first time since Vlad's arrival, the prince's expression flickered with calculation beyond the immediate cruelty. The messenger questions, numbers, rotes, the likelihood of ambush. A quick dialogue erupted among the officers. "We can use prisoners as bait," one guard suggested. "We can trade them and save our men," another argued. "We must keep fear. Impale one now and they will scatter." They traded 3 to 6 short lines in quick succession, names clipped, words like bargaining chips. Vlad listened, and then he chose, "Let the execution proceed," he said. "One must be made as example. Bring the instrument." His voice left no room. The foreman stepped forward with the stake and polished rope. He moved with a craftsman's economy, marking the point with a small chisel against the wood grain. He spoke to his crew in short sentences about the angle and the brace. The survivor watched the men and felt nausea like a physical thing push against his legs. He tried to speak again. "Vlad," he said, and his voice cracked. "He is Ein. He is not a rebel. He arrived 2 days ago. Ein sells furs." A guard cut him off with a boot against his ribs. 3 villagers, faces half hidden by shawls, saw the commotion and seized the moment. One of them, Mara, darted from the crowd, grabbed a guard by the cloak, and shoved dust in his eyes. Another pushed at a second guard. Their action created immediate confusion. The survivor's hands loosened for a breath. The foreman cursed and signaled to seize them. Guards turned their focus, and in the scramble the villagers slipped a cord around the survivor's wrists and yanked him into a shallow hollow by the clearing's edge. The rescue was ugly and hurried. The survivor tasted mud and ash and the fabric of a shawl in his mouth. They ran. The survivor heard shouts and the clash of boots on frozen ground. For the first time in the day, the survivor felt a different emotion. Relief that was thin and sharp. It arrived in his limbs as the adrenaline that had powered his lunge. But relief shifted quickly into horror when he heard the ring of iron on wood and an animal sound that could only be a man's last breath. The spectacle had not stopped. It proceeded in full view despite the brief rescue. Vlad reasserted order with a gesture, and the impalers tightened their technique into ritual. The chosen prisoner, someone the survivor now knew as Un, was dragged into position. The foreman directed men who braced the stake, took the prisoner, and positioned him against the wood. The survivor crouched behind a fold of a villager's cloak and watched through a slit in the shawl. He counted heartbeats, as if they were the ticks of a clock he could not stop. The mechanics of the stake, the chapter had promised a cold reconstruction of these details, unfurled in terrible precision. The craftsman gripped the body, shaped the entry point with a wedge to open a clean channel, and then drove the stake with repeated strikes, testing the angle to avoid splitting. They wrapped the base with ropes to steady the body. The foreman muttered measurements aloud, ensuring the stake entered at a point that would hold. The wood passing through clothing and muscle in a method practiced so often that their phrases sounded like inventory. When the stake finally fixed and the prisoner sagged, the crowd's reaction split between a collective intake and the low murmur of compliance. The survivor turned his face away and pressed his forehead to his folded hands until pain flared. He felt a surge of something that was not relief, not fear only, but a raw, active hatred. He spat mud at a passing guard and felt the guard's hand clamp his jaw in retaliation. In the scuffle, a villager pushed him and whispered, "Go. Carry what you saw." tell them, the survivor realized then that his action had shifted the moral calculus. He had tried to save one man, failed, but had forced a rupture in the intended lesson. The messenger rode up again as soldiers were reorganizing. Vlad walked the line of stakes and watched the way the men had set the bodies. "It must be clear," he said to his captain, voice like a tool. "They must know the cost of rebellion and the logic of order." The survivor listened and felt how words turned flesh into example. He did not come to terms with that logic. Instead, he felt another shift in feeling, numbness that edged toward duty. He would carry witness because memory could be a weapon if placed in the right hands. They slipped him away in the ensuing chaos. A woman in a wool cloak led him by the arm, whispering instructions. "Go to the mill road, avoid the valley. Do not stop until you reach the east lane." He obeyed because obedience was the fastest path to preserve his lungs and limbs. He ran with the shawl over his head, stumbling through churned mud until the clearing fell behind him and the line of stakes receded into a gray horizon. Later that afternoon, when sunlight passed low and thin over the plain, the survivor stopped at the edge of a river and sat on a stone. He unknotted the talisman and rubbed the carved wood between his fingers as if extracting a map. He could still hear the clap of metal on wood. He felt guilt like a weight in his belly. He also felt a strange, brittle clarity. He would tell the story exactly as it had happened, including his attempt to unbind Ain and the villagers' rescue, and the messenger's arrival. He would not soften the facts. He would enumerate the mechanics of the stake, the foreman's measurements, the angle of insertion. He would keep record, not sermon. He found a traveler who would carry a message to a scribe in the nearest market town. The traveler names, dates, places. He described the road where he had first seen the stakes and the smell of pitch in the impaler's workshop. He described the foreman's chisel and the messenger's news. He named Vlad's precise words and the captain's bark. The traveler took a folded cloth with the survivor's notes and promised to bring them to the scribe, who kept records for the district priest. Word moved in small, gnawed threads. A priest recorded the survivor's account in ink and bound it to a ledger. The survivor returned, months later, to places that had folded into the saga. He stood at the site of the impaler's workshop and measured the distance to the clearing, noting the placement of benches and the angle of the sun through the doorway at dawn. He talked to carpenters about the grain of wood that would best hold a stake, and to a local surgeon about the likely time a body could last fixed on a pole. He anchored facts to facts until his memory had a scaffold. The survivor met with other witnesses and compiled statements. He would not elevate anyone prematurely. He insisted on names and times. When the documentary narrator later summarized the scene in a detached voice, he did so with citations, the messenger's reports, the foreman's notes, the scribe's ledger. The narrator kept tone neutral and precise, reading dates, distances, and quotations. The survivor allowed those facts to stand as the proof that atrocity had been engineered, not enacted by accident. A twist revealed itself as he collected testimonials. 2 officers had argued that day not only about spectacle, but about an old feud. One officer had been passed over for promotion and sought a demonstration to reassert his standing. The messenger's arrival had given Vlad a pretext to choose a public demonstration rather than a tactical retreat. The survivor's earlier belief that the execution was purely an act of deterrence shifted into the realization that small private ambitions had multiplied into public terror. The discovery altered how witnesses understood the earlier events. It was concrete, a ledger entry where the captain wrote of promotion and of a cut from a rival. The survivor confronted a guard who had pulled him down that morning. The guard's name was Radu. Their exchange was raw and short. "Radu," the survivor said, "why did you strike me so hard?" "Radu," the guard answered, voice clipped, "because you tried to stop the process, because my orders were clear. Because Master so," they argued in quick lines that traced responsibility from raw hands to the prince's decree. The conversation did not absolve anyone, but it placed blame in reach of ink and memory. Months moved on. Vlad's name circulated as both ruler and terror. Travelers wrote of the road lined with stakes. The survivor traveled to the market town and read his account aloud to a small crowd in a dark room where the priest kept candles low. People short, direct questions. Did you see the foreman mark the stake? Yes. Did the messenger arrive before or after the captain's decision? Before. Who picked the prisoner? The captain answered to the prince. Each question and answer anchored events. The survivor did not seek vengeance in speeches. He sought a record that would not allow the spectacle to be turned into legend that erased the faces of the dead. He met with Mara and the other villagers who had helped him. They spoke in hushes about what they had seen and what they had done. They repeated names. They gave details about the foreman's techniques and the craftsman's tools. These repeated facts built a stronger account than any single memory could. Vlad's reign did not end immediately. He maintained order through fear and calculation. But the ledger and the priest's notes moved into the hands of envoys who cared about the prince's reputation. Foreign envoys read accounts and asked questions. A page of precise statements, the kind the survivor had insisted upon, had more effect than a single grief-struck cry. The survivor watched as small bureaucracies opened a way to pressure the prince. Reports, merchants' complaints, the judgment of neighboring lords. At the last, when forces realigned and the prince's enemies closed in, Vlad's fall came with the same merciless concreteness as his punishments. He was judged by men who quoted ledger entries and scribed notes. The survivor attended one hearing in a low gallery and watched men read the foreman's chisel marks out loud. Men who had once stood at the clearing read the messenger's route and time and matched it to watchman's logs. The technical detail that had held a life together at the stake now helped build a legal case. The survivor did not celebrate. He watched facts he had forced into being put to other use. In the final hearing, a man who had been a captain that day testified in 3 sharp lines about command decisions. A craftsman explained exactly how stakes had been prepared. The survivor felt a strange, flat sensation as the scene closed. The court's decisions were not poetic. They were lists of dates and names and counts. They were the opposite of spectacle. The survivor saw that removing spectacle from cruelty made the cruelty harder to justify. When the verdict landed, it was administrative and brutal. Removal, seizure, exile for some, execution for others charged with particular crimes. Vlad's end was not one theatrical death, but a collapse of power recorded in accounts and seals. The survivor listened as the documentary narrator later described the end in cold voice, quoting the ledger. Measures taken, property seized, men named. The survivor felt neither vindication nor consolation. He felt, finally, a settling of purpose. The job of a witness is not to right the world but to keep the record accurate. He returned once more to the frozen plain. The line of stakes had been cleared, but one broken stake remained half, buried in mud. A feather lay beside it, lifted by wind and then grounded again. He knelt, ran his hand along the splintered wood, and remembered Ein's face as they had met under bright morning light. He touched the talisman, and then wrapped it in cloth, and placed it inside a ledger cover with copies of the witness statements. He handed that package to the scribe, who agreed to keep it safe and to deliver copies to merchants and priests beyond the valley. On the road out of the clearing, a child ran up and asked, "What did you do?" The survivor looked at the child's mud, splattered knees, and answered with short sentences, "I tried to stop one. I failed. I told others." "I wrote it down." The child nodded as if that were a full answer. The survivor walked on with the scribe's horse carrying the ledger and the talisman. The final scene closed on an exact action. He crossed the same route where he had first seen the line of stakes months before and reached the point where the cart had turned. He took one last look at the receding plain. Then he folded the ledger into his cloak and walked east toward the market town to deliver a copy himself. He did not speak of heroics. He acted. The record left his hand. The survivor had traded bodily safety for a duty, to carry and to tell. That trade ended with a step onto the road and a folded ledger pressed to his chest, a concrete object moving from one set of hands to another.